Oh, this one. Good morning. How you doing? That wasn't a lawyer joke. I can do better than that. I'm Dave. I teach legal ethics, just so you know, as game theory, strategy, Thomas Schelling, von Neumann, all of that. They asked me to come talk to you folks, and I still practice law, so you can shoot me if you want, with a firm up in San Francisco, and I have a lot of friends in businesses up there who are engineers. And so when I was asked to do this, I sent out an email saying, what do you think a lawyer could say to a group of basically network engineers that would be interesting to them? And I immediately realized this was a poorly formed question, because do you know how many different ways there are to say nothing? There are a ton. And I thought, okay, what should I do that could sort of, I did get one useful suggestion now that I think of it. The suggestion was, I know why they invited you, and I bid. I said, why is that? And the idea was that your signal to noise ratio is off, and they brought me in to rectify the imbalance. There's been too much signal over the last couple of days. And the lawyers come in because you've been getting definitive answers and conclusive algorithms and things like that, and you needed somebody to come in and say, it depends. You needed somebody to come in and cast a vote for maybe. And that's what we do in the legal department. But I picked three current topics, and what I'm going to try and do is talk about what we in the law do when we look at your community, when we look at engineers and we look at people who are building infrastructure, and what I think of as a sort of clash of cultures. And I want to talk about policy going forward on three topics: net neutrality yet again, privacy yet again, and the fact that educational institutions are becoming the new sort of authoritarian dictators of the network space. And I'm going to go through those, but I want to start off by saying the interesting thing to me is where we go from here on each of these questions. And if you get all of your information, as I do, from Wikipedia, you learn immediately that there's a debate. There's a famous phrase, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And the contestants are Yogi Berra and Niels Bohr. And usually you don't think of them together, but it's an interesting problem. And the reason it's interesting to me is because in your line of work, unlike a lot of areas of university communities, you actually have to make decisions. You have criteria, you have parameters, and you actually say, it's going to be this way. We're going to do a new ERP. Everybody's going to kill themselves. Whatever it is, you actually have to bring the hammer down. And that distinguishes law from a lot of other disciplines in the university environment. We actually have to make decisions. Somebody wins, somebody loses. And the thing you learn early on in law school is that it's all a zero-sum game. You can have net positives, but those generally work themselves out. And when you get disputes, somebody's always going to go away losing. And that's what we deal with. Our orientation is towards how you're going to minimize net losses and how you try and maximize the possibility of gains. And the thing that haunts us is the fact that the one real law is the law of unintended consequences. You have no idea what's actually going to happen once you take this messy melange of variables and slam them together and you make a prediction and go forward. And I wanted to tell a little story about this. It's my favorite story apropos of this space before I start talking about the policy disputes that I wanted to work through with you. So back in 1956, the United States Department of Justice realized that, strictly speaking, AT&T was a telecommunications monopoly. And this, I thought, was a good job on them, right? They sort of figured that one out. It was in part mandated, and they sued AT&T under the antitrust laws. The antitrust laws are one of the things that I specialize in, and they're one of the things that overlaps with your world in some cases fairly substantially. And they said, they executed a consent decree in 1956, and the consent decree said, AT&T, you may not engage in any line of business other than the provision of communications, I think even over wireline, but certainly provision of communications. And AT&T at the time had this little outfit in Murray Hill, New Jersey, called Bell Labs. And these guys at Bell Labs, they came up with this interesting thing, and it was called, latter day, Unix. And they went to the lawyers, And the lawyer said, oh, that's interesting. What's that? It's an operating system. And Stephen Breyer, who's now on the Supreme Court, in 1972 wrote a famous article saying, software will never be sold separately from hardware, so we don't need to worry about it as a market. So this is back when that's the way people thought. And so it's Ritchie and Thompson, and they're writing C, and they're doing this, and they come up, and they say, we've got this operating system. And the lawyers say, that's great, you can't do anything with it. Because the Justice Department, capital J, capital D, people we don't want to fight, say that you can't engage in any line of business outside of provision of communications. And so they say, well, it's cool anyway, and they go university to university, and they would do presentations, and this is all in one of my favorite books. It's called A Quarter Century of Unix by Peter Salas, if you ever are interested in this history. And sometimes, being engineers who do nothing other than think all day about how to discharge their legal obligations, you all have complaints about us, let me tell you. Going the other way, it ain't pretty. Remind me before we're done to tell you my friend from Sony Computer Entertainment and what he does with his engineers. But anyway, they sometimes go and they'll demonstrate, Unix and stuff, and they'll forget to take the big old spool tape that has a copy of the operating system on it. And they left one at Berkeley, and that became BSD. And BSD metastasized into, and this is so unfair, I'm a Berkeley guy, Stanford University Network. What's up with that? Ripping off BSD Unix? That's so wrong. And there's an argument, you can argue about it, but there's an argument that the inability to sort of expropriate and try and leverage and monetize Unix is what allowed it to, number one, progress sort of in a ubiquitous fashion among university communities and then out into the business environment, and number two, to splinter into an unbelievable number of incompatible branches on a tree. I have a chart, you can look it up on the internet. It's crazy. It's beautiful. It's just this wonderful fragmentation story. And then there's Minix, and Minix becomes Linux, and then it starts to converge again. It's this wonderful story. But I think of that every time I think, the Justice Department had no clue whatsoever that when they went after the obvious low-hanging fruit, wow, you're a monopoly, let's do something about that, that they would set up the system where they were firewalling software from communications and allowing this sort of seedbed of innovation to go forward. So telephony is often on my mind when I think about bandwidth, because the Justice Department and the Antitrust Division and the FCC have dealt with what we call the last mile problem, maybe it's the last 3 mile problem, since there was wire. And in 1980, President Reagan was elected, some of you will remember. A guy named William Baxter from Stanford became head of the Antitrust Division. And he simultaneously did 2 things. He stood down the 14-year-long Justice Department case against IBM for monopolizing mainframes. He confessed error, said, we want to stop the case. And he sued to break up AT&T. And that got everyone's knees jerking in different directions, because you don't know what kind of beast is this. He's caving on one case, and then he's going after the natural monopoly. And by the phrase natural monopoly, what I mean is this. The idea of the AT&T breakup was to allow competition to flourish in what we would call backbone space now, in long-distance telephony, firewall the local monopolies, and do what we could with them, but allow competition to flourish where it could. And that structure, where you've got the sort of interconnections, MCI came up into that space, that structure has always been problematic. And it's been problematic because the standard argument is this. If you've got high fixed costs, and you don't want to duplicate infrastructure, you don't want to run too many lines to houses, it looks like, and you have very decreasing marginal cost across a large fraction of demand, it looks like what economists would call a natural monopoly. And that's problematic from every single legal policy perspective. You take that to Washington, and people go, ugh, let's regulate it. And then you kick it to FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or some public utilities type commission. And then you have these administrative records that would fill even this room about what you can put in your rate base and how we price this access. And you have these sort of nightmarish sorts of things because it's a tough problem. If we can't rely on competition to constrain opportunistic behavior, what do? Well, we regulate. Is regulating easy? No. Can regulators be captured? Yes. And why on earth would that be relevant to this conference and to communications and to network build-out? there's a case pending in the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit with the happy name Verizon against FCC. And the FCC, I sometimes wonder if it passes more regulations or gets sued more often. It's neck and neck. But why does the FCC get sued so often? If you're regulating very large, powerful, influential companies, you're going to spend a lot of time in court. Now, you all will know this history a lot better than I do. So here is a very crude, oversimplified history of the sort of policy of the network. Intelligence at the ends, dumb and indifferent in the middle. And we call that the end-to-end principle, and we call that net neutrality. And the FCC in 2010 passed regulations designed to constrain the ability of, I want to call it last mile, but backbone to house providers to discriminate among packets. And that is sitting in the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit right now. Verizon has challenged the FCC's authority. And I want to set aside the legal question. There's a very interesting legal question as to whether Congress has actually given the FCC power to do this. Congress gave the FCC power to classify the internet as either information technology, in which case it has the statutory authority to regulate it as a common carrier, or communications technology, I'm sorry, or information technology, in which case its regulatory power is more obscure. Verizon is saying you don't have control over the internet. Nobody has control over the internet. If Congress wants to give you control over the internet, great. And this, if I can shift from sort of natural monopoly economics to philosophy, this is the classic debate, and it's one that I expect that you all spend some time thinking about. It's freedom from and freedom to. Now, Verizon's argument is a freedom argument. I sink the cost into this infrastructure, I need to recoup my costs. I can do that a couple of different ways. I can charge zero price to all providers, charge a positive price to the users. I can also have a fast lane and a slow lane. I can slice packets. You can tell me how finely they can do it. They can do it more finely than not at all. And the FCC came in and was persuaded, no. You cannot discriminate among price. You cannot discriminate among, I'll call it packets, but among sources of information. That debate, from an economic point of view, is a very, very, very interesting one. Because the one clear statutory mandate, the one thing Congress could agree on telling the FCC was, you shall pursue the policy of encouraging network build-out. Now, how do you encourage network build-out? One way is to allow people who build out the network to make money. There you go, that was simple. And that would argue, obviously, against net neutrality. Because the one thing that they want to do is to discriminate so they can extract more revenue. And if they extract more revenue, then they can, well, who knows, but arguably feed it back into the infrastructure at the back end. There's a fascinating brief filed in this case, and this one you all might actually want to read. It's the Internet Engineers Brief. Steve Wozniak is one of the people on it. Leonard Kleinrock is one of the people on it. And they argue for a different vision, and this is what I call the pump priming vision. And I was fascinated to learn that you guys heard yesterday the argument in favor of greater disparities in internet access in Mexico. The sort of trickle down, if you put in really high margin stuff at the top and focus on getting the high margin stuff, that'll drive demand and then you can build out. The great thing about economics, Harry Truman once supposedly asked, my kingdom for a one-armed economist, so they can't say on the other hand. In the 50s, that was a funny joke. The great thing about economists is that if you introduce even a little reality into the models, and I like the mathematics of the modeling, the aesthetics are really nice, but if you interject just a teeny tiny bit of reality, you get the following phrase: multiple equilibria are possible. And I'm glad you invited me here because I want to translate that for you. Multiple equilibria are possible means damned if I know. How'd you get that number? Stochastic estimation. What? Right? Their argument is the great thing about dumb in the middle, intelligence at the ends, is that it allows startups, YouTube, Google, Twitter, whoever, to lower their costs of providing content. That makes it easier for them to get started. And by allowing competition to flourish at the end, you drive demand for the pipe. So the more stuff people want to get, the more pipe will be built out. And that's a perfectly cogent argument. That could even be true. I distinctly remember I was invited to talk about open source software in Rome several years ago for a week, and I was on a panel between a guy from Vivendi Universal and a guy from an Italian telecoms company that was doing build-out. And they were almost killing each other because the Vivendi person basically said, you people are making money because people want to steal our content, and you're selling them bandwidth precisely so they can download more MP3 files and pauperize me. And it's one of these great moments where the guy from the telecoms company sort of shrugged and said, yeah. So? This is news to you? So it could well be true that the building out the ends, or lowering the costs at the ends, increases demand, and that demand can be passed through in positive prices to users, and that is the sort of maximally good way to build out. It also could be true that fast lane, slow lane would do better. Intuitively to me, it seems like if people are willing to pay a premium for streaming, if you allow, or genericize it to time-sensitive content, if you allow a lot of pipe for that purpose, you can charge more for it. And the ability to charge a lot for that and degrade a channel for email and whatever else, price discriminate, would allow you to extract more revenue from your investment in the last mile, and that should induce investment in the last mile. And the interesting point that's made in this debate is as follows. The ends are competitive as all get out. You read the Wall Street Journal technology page, the New York Times technology page, all you read about are these crazy startup companies. They're not as bad as they used to be. Remember Pets.com with the sock puppet? People invested in that. Right? I mean, they had more money then, but still. The ends are really, really competitive. Not so much competition in the last mile. That's the problem that people have talked about and continue to talk about. And arguably, the policy prescription the FCC is pursuing is maximizing competition where it is already most robust, on the theory that this will trickle down and push investment in the area where competition is most problematic. Could be right. Now, traditionally, what you would do in a situation like this where you've got sort of arguments going both ways is you defer to the expert agency, which is the FCC. And we'll see where the DC Circuit goes with this one. I expect it'll be affirmed. See above, Niels Bohr, Yogi Berra, who knows. But it's a fascinating debate because this one's been going on forever. The only thing that has changed, and I do think that this is a significant change, is that the debate began when the internet was used by you folks. It began when the internet was a relatively homogeneous environment of technology-savvy people who shared lots of common norms. Goldman Sachs was not on it. And you cannot expect hundreds of billions of dollars of investment and billions of people joining an environment to have no effect. It's unrealistic. When that happens, the ratio of technology to retail politics as opposed to the politics of technology, which I don't know deeply, but I just observe the fights among engineers and mathematicians are particularly interesting because of the high degree of certainty displayed on all sides. We lawyers at least know we're making it up. That shift, the shift from ARPANET, the shift from I'm writing my friends from Stanford to UCLA, there are 1,000 of us here, to the entire economy is shifting on top of us, is the important thing to watch, because the days have been gone for about 15 years back when this was distributed among university communities and research-oriented businesses. And as things begin to root through Washington, D.C., interesting things happen. That's kind of the lesson of the software industry in general. You can check and see how many lobbyists Microsoft had in 1979, 1980, and how many they have now. And each new company that hits it, same iteration. It's sort of like their preference on patents. They start out with none. And then the next thing you know, they have 44,000. And that's a process of growing up in the modern business environment. Which brings me to my second topic. So that's number one, and neutrality. Oh, let me say one thing about neutrality, and I'll postpone a little bit for education. You all, running networks at educational institutions, or a network connecting educational institutions to some extent, at our university and at every university I'm familiar with, end-to-end is just absurd. We control what comes into the university. We prioritize packets because we don't believe they're all equal. And we have dormitories full of students who are stealing music. And if we don't push that back a little bit, nothing else is going to get through. And we have really big firewalls, and we have really big security measures, and we manage the living heck out of it. Now, we're an end, that's fair. But when you think about the notion, which appears in the briefs in this case, it's kind of charming. The premise of the internet is that anybody should be able to contact anybody else at any time. To the extent you spend any fraction of your time accessing through an organization's network, that's no longer true. Because as the world has moved on to it, people have spotted risks they don't like, they've spotted priorities they have, and you can do it at home now, but it's an interesting data point, and it's an interesting thing to think about when you think about the sort of policy mandate. The observed behavior of a lot of very sophisticated institutions, one of which I'll talk about in a minute, is much to the contrary of this sort of notional anybody, anytime. The reason for that, incidentally, you can correct me on this, and I want to leave time to talk so you can try your lawyer jokes out. When I started teaching internet law in 1998, 99, something like that, I told students, there's a lot of technology associated with the internet, but your lawyers, the one thing you care about is this. What the internet does is lower transactions cost. That's it. That's what it does. And what that means is anything any human being on this planet wants to do to or for you, it makes it easier for them to do it to you or for you. And oddly enough, there are a lot of people who want to do not pleasant things. I used to joke that if it weren't for pornography, online gambling, and stealing music, the build-out rate would be a tiny fraction of what it is. And that's an interesting comment on the species, but if anybody wants to try and dispute that, I would defer to you. But my observation is that that's a large, large fraction. I had a copyright class. I distinctly remember sitting in the back of a copyright class next to a student. I was assessing a junior faculty member. It's a copyright class, and my student leans over to me and says, "Here, look." And I look at her file, and she's got 5,000 MP3 files on her computer. And I thought, you know, that's illegal. So second topic. Second topic. There is introduced last month, I have to get this right, CISPA. I wrote this down because all of these, there was PIPA and there was SOPA, and this is the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. So one of the things that we think about less, at least at our university and among sort of intellectual property types, is security and its relationship to privacy. My friends who are privacy scholars think about this a lot. But let me just make an observation. So CISPA allows for the sharing of information between certain governmental agencies and private companies. And the basic idea, I think, is the government can inform company X, backbone provider X, ISP X, saying, we think that this person may be a person of interest for security reasons. Do you have any data about them? Now, when I talk to technology audiences, the one thing I always find is there's a huge misapprehension about what cops can already do. People think, oh my gosh, that's terrible, and they think there's this huge delta between the status quo and sort of what's being proposed, and it's smaller than you might think. If you interpose a warrant requirement in a special court, all bets are off. You can do almost anything. If you think about technology historically in the criminal context, why can we take blood samples? Why can we now do swabs? Why can we invade your home, get a warrant on your laptop? We can do anything to your laptop, we just need a warrant. How tough is a warrant to get? Well, gee, let me think. I mention this because the sense of security that a lot of people in the technology community have is a technology-dependent sense of security, and in a sense, that's right. The encryption will always win. For a large fraction of information that's not encrypted to that degree, most of it, I think, that's not great assurance. And as people move more and more, so that move to a position where more and more of their lives reside on drives that connect to networks that you all build, it will be more and more common that people in government say, wow, there's a lot of information there. And just as you used to be able to get warrants, to get phone records, that is going to happen. And we have fights about it. The president has a directive on it that's being contrasted to CISPA. If we get one really good attack from China, you can have every assurance that security in your world will be treated with the gentle touch that we got in the Patriot Act. Because when the world gets into your space, the world's rules are ultimately going to govern. And fear is a very powerful motivator, which is one of the things in the law school we talk about all the time. If you have a world in which there are parameters and there's logic, it's a very misleading picture to a world in which it's the greatest possible disaster that could be predicted becomes the modal case. And we regulate to the modal case rather than 4 or 5 deviations off the mean. I flag that because the interesting thing really is these bills keep reappearing. They keep getting shot down, but this is not a matter of principle, I don't think, for anyone in Washington. This is pragmatics, and the pragmatics can shift with one bad event. Now, part of me, let me shift to my third topic because I want to make sure that I leave time to have the standard questions that people have of lawyers, like, why do you exist? Your overhead. I want to talk a little bit about universities. And I was thinking about whether to talk about this on my way over, but I want to see, I'd be interested in your reactions because it's a case I followed very closely, and I'm thinking about Aaron Schwartz. So universities have historically this sort of notional openness idea. We're very open. What open means is a very ill-defined term, just like open source does not mean unlicensed. We're all very open, and we're for the promotion of learning, and that's great. And then we look around, and funding is not spouting at us from every tree. Fair assessment? We're not awash in money. And so what did we discover? We discovered patents. And we now have technology transfer offices. And we now have this wonderful division, which you folks need not worry about at all, between division. It's a division with a really big exponent between humanities and people who can get contracts with the Department of Energy to fund labs. Because when salaries go backward at the UCs, there are 2 ways to respond to that. One is my salary goes down, and the other is that I increase my overhead cut into my lab, and DOE doesn't care. And we become more and more and more separate. Well, one of the things that goes on with that, of course, and this I think is more life sciences, but we're not immune to it in any field really, is some Glaxo comes in and says, you guys are doing really interesting work. How'd you like $200 million? Well, I'd like that very much, actually. I have 200 million good reasons to like that. And we now have collaborations, and we have sort of partial integration of university research functions and commercialization. And from one point of view, I'm all for that. I think that's wonderful. The quicker we can get useful things out into society doing good stuff, the better. That's great. Companies don't have a culture of openness. It's actually the exact opposite. It's how can we protect what we have? And the reason I thought about this is that, apropos of Aaron Schwartz, is You all know this story, I assume? Maybe I'm making too big an assumption. Okay. So I talked to my students about it, and I told them, if you find yourself in a booth with a rack of computers holding your bicycle helmet over your face, you've made a mistake. I go for simple. You've made a mistake. How could he get into MIT's network and just set up a laptop to patch in and run and download 30,000 copies of copyrighted articles? That, by the way, is not a tough call from the copyright point of view. That's easy. So MIT, good school, does a lot of this kind of stuff that I've been talking about. They have this culture of openness. The people they're doing business with, the government, companies, they don't. And the more high-value content, the more content that is sitting on a network that somebody's going to be really mad if it gets out, and we're not talking about JSTOR articles. You see how mad they got. And these are academic journals. The less able you're going to be to have the kind of openness that you historically associate with universities. Now, this is a balancing act. All of life is a balancing act, so that's not really a big observation. But it's a particularly delicate one because the cultures, which is the point I keep coming back to, are very different. The Schwartz case turned out, I think, so tragically because, to reiterate something I said a moment ago, people just don't understand how the criminal justice system works. The United States Department of Justice does not need MIT's consent to indict anybody. They don't need MIT's consent to continue a case. They don't need MIT's consent to do anything. And that's uniformly true. And one of the interesting things as society moves on to the apparatus you all run is we tend to express our distaste for behavior by criminalizing it. We have an unbelievable number of criminal laws in this country. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that means that you now have legal rules that apply to you over which you have no control. You as a university can give somebody a mulligan. Go forth, sin no more. You've made your statement, fine. Slap your penguin on the rack and go. Doesn't work like that outside. Doesn't work like that with funders. And so this sort of replacing the revenue stream is bringing these cultures into what I think is an irreconcilable conflict. Now, one of the things that we in law school know is that whenever you collide with a big amount of money, the big amount of money wins. That's actually not in any statute book. I'm just offering you some free legal advice. When I think about what I'm told we do at my school, which is just a small school, it's not University of Minnesota with 60,000 people, do we put MP3 packets at the head of the queue? No. If we found that somebody was seriously at risk from a stalker who was using the network to follow someone or to harass them, would we search, find, and attempt to apprehend them? Every time we talk about privacy and security and all of this, I find that people's reactions shift with the stories I tell them. When I talk about law students being harassed at Yale Law School by having people post things on them, about them on bulletin boards, when I drive it down to my famous example of the end-to-end principle, the Nuremberg Files website, which you may or may not have heard of. This was a website that would post the names, home addresses of abortion doctors and do streams from live cams. And if a doctor was shot, they would cross out the name on the website. Anything I can do with freedom of speech, which is a kind of a vacuous principle, people think there's more there than there is, I can do with net neutrality and internet freedom. Universities are sort of facing this interesting thing where you could disaggregate them and everybody could move to San Diego and have an MIT education, which was not previously, or at least part of it, the classroom part, which is probably the least valuable part. As we sort of disaggregate, we also are trying to develop a stronger sense of community and a stronger sense of safety and a stronger sense that this is an environment in which we prioritize learning and in which people don't go around in fear for their well-being. Those objectives are in tension with each other, as the economic objectives are in tension with each other. And those political disputes, I don't think are going to scale quite as much as the end-to-end stuff that I was talking about before. And I don't know in terms of bandwidth management and build-outs, the kind of stuff that you folks may have more exposure to, I don't know that they're going to have that much of an effect. But the things that can be done with the infrastructure affect the social significance of the infrastructure, if you will, the way that the rest of us relate to it and perceive it as a threat or an enabling force. And that is going to have, I think, more significant and more politicized elements going forward. And the sort of fraction that's purely technical and the fraction that dates to the old days is going to become relatively quieter. Not maybe in the last mile, but within institutions like this, within institutions like mine, within institutions like MIT, because I'm wondering in the back of my mind, is that server closet locked? And I have to think, knowing university administrations, the answer to that question is yes. Because if it's not, and somebody walks in there to write a story about it, how are you going to explain it? So the broader lesson from a legal point of view, we're all about making choices, and we're all about recognizing sort of the imperfect knowledge that we have and the certainty, the only certainty being that whatever we think we're doing, we're probably doing, if that, and maybe not that at all, 20 other things we have no clue about, and it's this state of sort of unbelievable ignorance and helplessness that we revel in all the time, which is why we can say maybe and it depends and hedge in the way that you all love so much. Those are topics that I think we're all going to be wrestling with more going forward as we try and figure out how to fund build-outs, as we try and figure out what trade-offs are worth getting the money, and as we try to figure out what level of openness and what level of security we're willing to trade off on a localized basis, because that certainly is going on. The law lags, and I think is inevitably going to lag, and it is a very, very crude instrument. But precisely for that reason, when its forces are brought to play and when sentiment is aroused sufficient to cause action, it has a very large footprint. So I hope to have a little bit of a conversation with you folks in which we can talk about your perspectives, which I can pass on to lawyers, and we can each sort of roll our eyes and say, thank God, we're back in our environments now. But it's a series of things that I think are worth thinking about and hopefully achieving some alignment on approaches that are acceptable, even if the sort of notional optimal is unattainable by mere legal means. So thanks very much. I'd be happy to talk, take questions, or anything that you want to do. I hope I've said some terribly provocative things. If not, I can make stuff up.
Yep. On net neutrality, I would be interested to hear you compare that against another distribution medium most of us have, and I would say most of us probably dislike, and that is the cable television, satellite television, where there the content providers have turned around and said, you shall pay me to carry my content, and the consumer has lost choice. How would, if we lose the net neutrality, would we not end up in, and have the providers thought about that, where the argument could turn around on them? They don't get to charge for fast lanes, slow lanes. They get content providers saying, you shall pay me to carry my traffic.
Yeah, so there's, it's funny, when you said of lost choice, I'm trying to think how many channels there are now. There's this old Pink Floyd song from The Wall, 24 channels, and it's...
But the consumer doesn't get to pick.
Tells you it was done in 1978. There is a problem on the last mile thing, and the one problem that I think is genuinely a sort of intractable one, where I would wheel out the antitrust laws, and I do think when you argue, when the FCC argues this is how you argue. You wheel off of this. So if I'm Cox and I offer cable, if I offer internet connection and telephony, there are some people I'm a complementor with. There are some sites that are just content sites, and I'm a complementor. Skype, other VoIP providers, that's a straight competitive situation. And when you've got something that is arguably a monopoly and maybe historically a natural monopoly, that's worrisome. So I would distinguish between situations where the provider is also a downstream competitor, and those services with which it competes have to be treated differently. That's not everything, but that's sort of a first approximation. There are a couple of examples like that. And the other concern, and I confess total ignorance on satellite and cable TV because to the extent possible I don't watch TV every time I turn it on. It scares me. And I just wish it would die. My wish. That'll really scare them. The other argument is that if you have an affiliated content provider or you own a content provider, you'll discriminate in favor of your own content. And it sounds like that's more where you're getting at, where I would be limited because now Cox or Comcast or Time Warner is only going to give me Time Warner channels. I worry about that less because I think that there is really an incentive to make the service as appealing as possible to the end user. And if all I do is favor my own content and you can't, by subscribing to my system, get content that you really demand, that lowers the value of my content, lowers the ability of the provider to price for it. I do think that incentive is real. There's a famous antitrust case called Brown Shoe, in which the argument was a vertically integrated shoe company should not be allowed to buy a bunch of retail shoe stores because then it would do nothing but put its shoes in those shoe stores. And the counter-argument to that is, having sunk the money into the square footage, you're going to try and get as much out of the square footage as possible. And if your shoes don't maximize demand, then just to get a return on that investment, you're going to put in whatever ghastly 3-foot-tall sandals people demand at the moment. This is San Diego. If you haven't seen them, just walk around. They're really amazing. High-heel flip-flops? Who'd have thought? I'm sure there's a patent somewhere. So it's an excellent point. I would distinguish between the downstream competition case, in which I think you do need oversight. What kind of oversight is a little bit tough, and the straight complementors case. Both concerns are expressed by the FCC, and both concerns are in fact avoided by a sort of must-carry zero-price regime. I think one concern is more pressing than the other. And if your choices on satellite TV or cable TV have gone down and it's less appealing, I think that's good. And whatever's causing that, I think we should do more of it.
Let's see if I can remember what I was going to say. The California Digital TV Competition Act, I guess it was AB 2987, that changed franchises from local cable TV franchises to state franchises. The rationale behind that was that the legislature happily declared that we had reached competition with UVerse competing with cable and satellite competing with both of those, and so consumers had 3 choices in most markets, and we've now had about 4 or 5 years experience with that, and what it looks like is that nobody's competing with anybody, that cable TV providers and the telephone companies have sort of agreed to stay in their own markets, and it sort of looks like we're worse off than before the Justice Department split up AT&T. It just, and a side effect of this is that a lot of rural areas that there is no effort to build out in them, and that's got a big social cost, that lower economic areas aren't getting any service. So is there an answer to that?
No. So there have been two, how provocative do I want to be? What the heck? So there have been 2 things that have always been problematic. and still are, the rural folks. And why are rural folks problematic? They're problematic because the per user build-out cost is astronomical, and you just don't have a huge number of people to amortize the build-out costs over. This, by the way, the place this really bites is electrification. If you go back to mid-century and you subsidize pushing electricity, this is Lyndon Johnson's project in Texas. And one reaction, the sort of economist reaction, is the same reaction economists have to New Orleans. It shouldn't exist. That just doesn't make any sense. And why should we make it easier for these high-cost users to be high-cost users? It's a very similar argument to the one that you hear about building suburbs way out in Sorrento Valley or wherever, and then building freeways to accommodate them and then clogging them with cars so that you facilitate white flight at a very high cost to the environment and everything else. There is a sort of straightforward argument that says, look, you want to be out there, send mail, chisel notes in stone, use carrier pigeons, whatever. Society as a whole is never going to buy that, and it has always been a policy, a telecommunications policy, to subsidize those folks, and you have cross subsidies going. Competition in the sort of endpoint is just hard, and I don't know why it is. There was the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was a deregulatory act that used the word shall 2,000 times. And for some reason, I just thought may would have been a more popular word. But that was supposed to promote competition in local telephony. The whole reason behind the AT&T breakup was to promote competition where it was possible, firewall the monopolies so they didn't impede competition, and then hopefully spring into, from the robust long-distance competition, into the local market. That hasn't actually worked. Cellular has done pretty well for straight, plain old telephone service, POTS, and it's doing a little bit for data. But if I had the answer to why it's so difficult from a corporate point of view, I would probably go run and invest in some company and then deploy it. It's a little bit hard. It's always been hard. The companies, if they're colluding, that's illegal, so I presume it's not that. And I don't know enough about the details of the individual build-out areas. But there's an intuition. One of the things is that people are sort of saying, do we run them along power lines? Do we do cable over power? How are we going to actually approach the build-out question? Because nobody wants 20 different local providers with 20 different wires. Replicating the infrastructure has always been considered high cost, second, third, fourth best. So your alternative is common carrier, and common carrier just sort of shifts it all into regulatory pricing. And I don't know if anyone has actually, when I was a law clerk, we would have Federal Energy Regulatory Commission proceedings. If anyone's ever tried to figure out what an adequate rate of return is on a utility, it's nuts. What do we do with San Onofre? Can you put retrofit costs into the rate base? If you don't, what's going to happen to it? We tinker with policy all the time. There was an effort in California in the 1990s to require transmission companies, electrical transmission companies, to take power generated by these alternative power plants that would burn ag waste and things like that, which is not an obvious way to clean up the air, but that was the sort of, we're going to reduce energy on imports, and so we'd have these plants that are reduce import energy reliance. You have these plants that are arguably totally inefficient from any point of view, except that they're in localities that have people in the legislature and they can create demand for waste. There's all of this sort of political cross-subsidization that you can't get away from, no matter how hard you try. So I don't think it's robust anywhere. The only thing that's really made a difference, as far as I can tell, is mobile, which is, I think, loosening things up. You have different sets of issues there. You have spectrum issues. The nice thing about spectrum is that it's redeployable in a way that the wires aren't necessarily. So you can sell spectrum and you can do different stuff with it. I have hope for that, but if you're talking about hope in a time frame that would encompass, say, your life, it's a tough one. That's a bad answer. I apologize, but it's just historically, it's just a really hard problem. We had a federal judge in Washington running the national telecommunications grid for a while, and obviously that's optimal. It says something about a company. We'll just pick a judge in Washington, and he'll decide everything. Other question? All the students in the front row. See, there's an exam for you people in the back. I didn't say that earlier.
If the laws and the regulations are kind of crude tools, and us technology people are kind of limited in our perspective scope, what do you suggest as alternatives for bridging the gap there?
Yeah, it's not a gap. Is it a gap? It is a gap. So here are a couple of things that have worked. So you remember SOPA. You remember what they did with SOPA. Wikipedia blacked out. You could do some sort of interesting civil disobedience stuff and do sort of disruption. That's just declaring a game of chicken. And there's a famous story, I don't know if it's actually true. So you remember Rip, Mix, Burn? Remember those ads for the Mac? Remember what rip? What did you rip? CD, mix, burn. So that played really well all the way from San Francisco to San Jose. As a matter of fact, it was really popular. Down Los Angeles way, that was less popular. And so there were a couple of games of chicken. We called them Napster and Grokster, in which the proposition was mooted in court, is Silicon Valley stronger than Los Angeles? This is my crude way of describing it. New York, different kettle of fish. And the answer is yes. So to some degree, the technology, I think, because law always lags it, this is like encryption, I think you're always going to be a step behind in terms of the efforts, in terms of what's actually happening. But the reason I mentioned Aaron Swartz is to put a parameter on that. You will always be able to do things that can't be stopped technically. The standard lawyer's response to that is to ratchet up the cost of doing that in a sort of crude deterrence methodology. And you get, so if I'm a U.S. attorney in Massachusetts, okay, what does my world look like? This kid, maybe he's not such a bad kid, but it's MIT. MIT does work with, let's assume, I don't know, safe assumption, defense contractors? Am I going to let that guy walk? Somebody who actually goes in and patches in? All of my incentives say he's got to feel some pain because we can't have it that everyone looks at this as free. That's the iteration. The iteration is not so much, can the law keep up with you folks? No. Copyright proved that, right? You can do encryption algorithms that will take people a long time to get through. And you can be moved on, and you can have people in the NSA worrying about that. You can stay a step ahead. If you get caught, what that dynamic means is that the natural response from the rest of the system is going to be to come down like a ton of bricks. And so it's this really ugly disequilibrium where the technology is going to be out in front. There will be a small subset of people who get caught, and those people are just going to get crushed. Because the political system, the legal system realizes that delta. And it's precisely the ability to stay ahead that makes the crude deterrence algorithm we in the law use. If it's only detectable 1 in 100 times, then the optimal punishment is 100 times what it would be if it were perfectly detectable. Now, as a sort of statement of arithmetic, I don't know that you can actually fight that. If you're that 100th person, that's $600,000 in civil fines, civil liability for downloading for the small number of uploading for a small number of people who get caught. And it's going to get worse. And the fight will turn internal. So what I see from my world for you folks is more, it's not you against Washington so much, it's going to be you against administrations, it's going to be you against internal mandates that are at odds, internal goals that are at odds with sort of the notion of openness and sharing and whatever that worked just fine before the world decided it was going to run itself on your back. And those you can't win. The internal fights, you have persuasion, but what are you going to do? You're going to black out the network to protest against the UC administration? It's an appealing thought, as I, admittedly, I mean, I sense everybody in the room saying, hey. And then obviously that lawyer told me it was okay. But that's a one-shot game, right? Yeah, no, that ain't good. There's a recession on. I don't know if anyone's told you. That's the dynamic I worry about most, because I do think the institutional structures are getting more at odds with what I've always perceived to be the core engineering ethos. That's been happening for a long time. It's more recent in universities than I've seen. It's been happening for a shorter time in universities. And the whole bullying thing, surprisingly enough, have you all followed? Everything is now about not letting kids be bullied. I have a 7-year-old, he's a first grader, so it's all, everybody's against bullying and sort of incivility and harassment in cyberspace is a big deal, and parents are getting in on the act, and they're talking to universities saying, what are you all doing about this? And universities are like, oh, freedom of speech. And that's not an acceptable answer to people whose kids are out there getting stalked, and you get the occasional outlier of somebody meets somebody on Facebook. Why you use Facebook, I have no idea. The true privacy violations, by the way, forget about the government. I mean, come on. I meet somebody on Facebook, turns out he's a serial killer. That's not good PR. That's a ratchet. That only ever goes one way. And when you've got a ratchet and a disequilibrium where people think the penalties have to be high to compensate for under-deterrence, there's your answer. You're always going to win until somebody loses, and that person is in a world of hurt. Now, what you can do to fight back against that, you can tout, the sort of virtues of openness. The FCC, the end-to-end regulation, that was a pretty big win. They didn't have to do that. Ideally, what I would like personally to see is Seattle to go end-to-end and Portland to go do what you want and see what happens. I would like some natural experiments to run. That's not going to happen. But so far, I don't think the tech community is doing bad. It's just fragile. It's very, very fragile. And when you get stockholders, when you get people whose main job is to interface with the capital markets, and the NSA wants to look in somebody's file, it's just a different dynamic. Long answer, sorry about that.